I never caused drama, never asked for anything, built my entire financial future around one promise my father made. The day he tried to erase it, I opened a folder I'd been building for 5 years. My name is Daniel Hargrove. I'm 38 years old, I live in Portland, Oregon, and until about 8 months ago, I believed my father was a man of his word. Let me set the scene properly, because context matters here. My father, Robert Hargrove, is 67. He spent 40 years working as a municipal engineer for the city of Portland. He's not a wealthy man by any stretch, but he's comfortable. Paid off his house in Beaverton. Has a pension. And about 12 years ago, he purchased a 2-bedroom apartment in the Pearl District, a neighborhood that has, in the decades since, transformed from an industrial afterthought into some of the most sought-after real estate in the city. That apartment, which he bought for $210,000 in 2013, is now conservatively valued at $485,000. I am his older son. My brother, Marcus, is 31, 7 years my junior. We grew up in the same house, went to the same schools, were raised by the same parents after our mother passed from breast cancer when I was 16 and Marcus was 9. Losing her changed all of us. It made me, in some ways, grow up faster than I should have. It made Marcus, in some ways, never quite grow up at all. That isn't a cruel observation. It's just the truth. Marcus has always been the one my father worries about. The one who calls in crises. The one who moves cities impulsively, changes careers annually, borrows money and repays it slowly or not at all. I love my brother. That's not the issue. The issue is what was promised to me, why it was promised, and what my father is now trying to do about it. 5 years ago, in the spring of 2020, my father sat me down at his kitchen table in Beaverton. I remember the evening precisely. It was a Sunday, the windows were open, and his neighbor Frank DeLuca was over for dinner, along with my father's longtime friend Carol Weston, who'd known our family since before my mother died. My father had been talking about estate planning, about what would happen to his assets when he passed, and he said something that I didn't treat as casual conversation. "Danny," he said, setting down his coffee cup, "I want you to have the Pearl District apartment. When I go, or when I'm ready to let it go, whichever comes first, it's yours. You've always been steady. You built something. It should go to you." Frank and Carol were both present. Both nodded. Carol said, "That's a good decision, Robert." Frank said nothing, but he was there. I thanked my father. I didn't make a big production of it. But I took it seriously enough that over the following months, I made financial decisions with that promise in mind. I didn't purchase a home of my own. Portland real estate is brutal, and knowing I had this coming, I chose to invest my savings in my business instead. I own a small but stable commercial HVAC company. I have 6 employees, a good reputation, and a lease on a workshop in Southeast Portland. The apartment was always the foundation of my future real estate position. I told my wife, Jennifer, about the promise that same night. She remembered. She always remembered. The conflict begins. The first indication that something had shifted came 14 months ago, in January of last year, when Marcus moved back to Portland from Austin. He'd been in Texas for 3 years, working in tech sales for a startup that eventually downsized him out. He came back with a girlfriend, Priya, some credit card debt, and the particular energy of a man who has convinced himself that his failures were entirely situational. My father was thrilled to have Marcus back in town. That's fair. Marcus is charming, funny, warm in the way that makes rooms feel lighter. He and my father started having Sunday dinners regularly. I joined when I could, but I run a business and I have 2 kids. My schedule is not always my own. I noticed, in small ways, that the temperature was shifting. My father started mentioning Marcus's housing situation frequently. He and Priya are paying $2,100 a month in rent. That's brutal. Or, Marcus says the rental market is impossible right now. Statements that were accurate and sympathetic, but that, in retrospect, were clearly building towards something. The conversation I had been dreading came 7 months ago, on a Tuesday evening in August. My father called me and asked if I could come over alone, not with Jennifer and the kids, just me. I drove to Beaverton after work, still in my work clothes, and sat down at the same kitchen table where he'd made me the original promise. He didn't waste time. "Danny, I've been thinking about the apartment. Marcus needs it more than you do right now. You're doing well. Your business is strong. You have Jennifer. He's trying to get stable. I think it makes more sense to transfer it to him." I sat with that for a moment. I asked him to repeat it, not because I hadn't heard, but because I needed to be sure I understood. He repeated it. I said, "Dad, you promised that apartment to me 5 years ago. At this table. Frank and Carol were here." He said, I know what I said. But I have the right to change my mind. It's my apartment. I'm still alive. He was calm. Not unkind, exactly, but resolved in the way that people get when they've already made a decision and are simply informing you of it. There was no discussion. There was no apology that held any real weight. There was just, I have the right to change my mind. I drove home and told Jennifer everything. She didn't say, I told you so, because she's not that kind of person. But her expression, measured, careful, told me she was already thinking about what we needed to do. That night, I started making notes. Building the case. I want to be absolutely clear about something. I did not want to fight with my father. I did not want to create a family rupture. I am not interested in punishing Marcus, who may not have fully understood what he was displacing when he accepted my father's new offer. But I had made financial decisions based on a promise made in front of witnesses. I had structured my life around an understanding that was explicitly stated, with two people in the room. A verbal promise of real estate is, legally speaking, a complicated thing. I knew this. I wasn't naive. But I also knew that the law recognizes something called promissory estoppel, the principle that when someone makes a clear promise, and another person reasonably relies on that promise to their detriment, the promisor cannot simply withdraw without consequence. I had relied on that promise. I had documentation to support it. The first thing I did was call Carol Weston. Carol is 71, sharp as a tack, and the kind of woman who keeps every piece of correspondence she's ever received. I explained what had happened and asked her, gently, whether she remembered that evening. She did. She remembered my father's exact words. She said, without hesitation, that she would testify to it. Then I called Frank DeLuca. Frank was more hesitant. He's known my father for 30 years and didn't want to get in the middle of a family dispute. But when I explained the legal context and what I was considering, he agreed to provide a written statement confirming what he'd witnessed. Second, I went through every email, text message, and card my father had sent me in the 5 years since that conversation. I found 3 separate references. In December 2020, in a Christmas card, he had written, "Looking forward to someday seeing you set up in the Pearl. It'll be yours before you know it." In February 2022, in an email discussing my business expansion, he had written, "Don't over-leverage yourself on real estate right now. You've already got the apartment coming to you, so be patient." In March 2023, in a text message, he had written, "Had the property appraised today. Up to $460,000. Not bad for your future, huh?" That last one was the one that made Jennifer exhale slowly when she read it. I gathered everything. Printed, organized, time-stamped. I built a file that was thorough, professional, and, I believed, legally meaningful. Then I called a real estate attorney named Sandra Okafor, whom I'd been referred to by a colleague. I laid out the entire situation in a 2-hour consultation. Sandra was direct. She told me that Oregon's statute of frauds generally requires real estate transfers to be in writing to be enforceable. However, she said, the doctrine of promissory estoppel could create an exception, particularly given the documented reliance on the promise, the years I had foregone purchasing property, the explicit references in written communications, and the witness statements. She said we had a meaningful case, though not a guaranteed one. She also noted that if my father had not yet transferred the property to Marcus, there were legal tools, including a lease pendens notice and a civil complaint, that could cloud the title and prevent a clean transfer until the matter was resolved in court. The goal, Sandra said, isn't necessarily to win in court. The goal is to make the transfer complicated enough that your father has to negotiate seriously. I asked her to draft the demand letter. Update 1, the letter. Sandra sent the demand letter to my father via certified mail in late September. It was 4 pages long. It outlined the nature of the original promise, identified Carol Weston and Frank DeLuca as witnesses, referenced the 3 documented written communications, and argued that I had materially relied on the promise to my detriment. Specifically, that I had chosen not to purchase real estate on at least 2 separate occasions due to the expectation of receiving the Pearl District apartment. It demanded that my father either honor the original transfer agreement or enter into mediation to discuss equitable compensation. The letter also noted, clearly professionally, that should my father proceed with transferring the apartment to Marcus without resolution, we would file a civil complaint and record a lease pendens against the property, which would prevent any sale or transfer from proceeding cleanly until the litigation was resolved. My father called me the day he received it. He was not pleased. "You're going to sue me," he said. "Your own father." "I'm asking you to honor your word, Dad. That's all I've ever asked. I told you, I have the right to change my mind. And I have the right to hold you accountable when your change of mind costs me something real. I'm not doing this out of spite. I'm doing it because I made decisions based on what you told me, in front of witnesses, over 5 years. You don't get to erase that. He hung up. He called back an hour later, calmer, and said he needed time to think. Marcus called me 2 days after that. I'd expected anger or defensiveness. Instead, he sounded confused and a little deflated. "Danny, I didn't know about any of this," he said. "Dad never told me he'd promised it to you." I believed him. I still do. Marcus is many things, but he's not calculating in that way. He'd been handed something without knowing the full story. "I know, Marcus," I said. "This isn't about you. But I need you to understand that I'm not going to let this go." He was quiet for a moment. "What do you want to happen?" "I want what was promised to me. Or I want to be fairly compensated for the decision I made based on that promise. One of those two things." He said he'd talk to Dad. Update 2. The mediation. My father agreed to mediation in October, which Sandra had suggested as the preferable first step before any court filing. We used a professional mediator named Gerald Yee, who had experience with family estate disputes. The session was held in a neutral conference room downtown, with Sandra present on my side and my father accompanied by his own attorney, a general practice lawyer named Tom Breckenridge whom he'd used for years. My father arrived looking tired. He looked older than I'd seen him look in years, not diminished, exactly, but worn. I felt a complicated ache sitting across from him at that table, because beneath all of this, he was still my father. But I kept Sandra's advice firmly in mind. Stay factual. Stay calm. Let the documents speak. Gerald opened by having each side present their understanding of the situation. My father's position was that he had made an informal, non-binding statement of intent 5 years ago, that circumstances had changed, and that as the legal owner of the property, he retained full discretion over its disposition. Tom Breckenridge argued that without a written agreement, no enforceable obligation existed. Sandra then walked through our documentation methodically. The witness statements from Carol and Frank. The Christmas card. The emails. The text message about the appraisal. She presented a calculation of demonstrable reliance, 2 specific periods, 2021 and 2023, when I had declined to pursue property purchase, with supporting communications in which I had referenced the apartment as the reason. In 2021, Jennifer and I had seriously considered purchasing a home in the Woodstock neighborhood. I had emails with a real estate agent from that period. We had not proceeded. In 2023, I had looked at a commercial property investment and opted out, citing the apartment. That communication existed too. Sandra argued that the doctrine of promissory estoppel created an equitable obligation, and that while she was not claiming a contractual right to the property itself, there was a strong basis for a claim of unjust enrichment and equitable relief, potentially valued at the difference in my financial position had I made different decisions. She also raised the question of whether transferring the apartment to Marcus while this dispute was pending would constitute a fraudulent conveyance if it appeared designed to defeat my claim. My father's attorney objected to the framing. But I watched my father during Sandra's presentation, and he was not objecting. He was listening. At one point, he picked up the copy of the text message, up to $460,000. "Not bad for your future, huh?" and stared at it for a long moment. Gerald called a recess after the first 2 hours. During the break, Tom Breckenridge asked to speak with Sandra privately. Jennifer, who had come for support but sat in the waiting area, squeezed my arm when I came out to update her. "How does it look?" she asked. "I think he knows he has a problem," I said. Update 3. The counteroffer. The week after mediation, Sandra received a written proposal from Tom Breckenridge on behalf of my father. It was not the property. It was a cash payment of $85,000, framed as settlement in full of any claims arising from the 2020 conversation. The letter was careful and legally precise, and notably, it did not admit that any promise had been made. Sandra and I discussed it at length. $85,000 was meaningful money. It wasn't nothing. But we both knew what the apartment was worth, $485,000, growing in a neighborhood that showed no signs of cooling, and we both knew what I would have done with that equity position. The $85,000 felt less like acknowledgement and more like a dismissal dressed up in professional language. I also, privately, was bothered by the framing. No admission. No accountability. My father wanted to pay me to go away quietly and pretend that what he'd said, in front of witnesses, over 5 years of correspondence, had meant nothing. I declined. Sandra sent back a counter. We would accept a resolution in one of 2 forms. Option A. My father transfers the apartment to me as originally promised, and I execute a side agreement acknowledging Marcus's housing needs, meaning I would allow Marcus and Priya to rent the apartment from me at a below-market rate for up to 3 years, giving them time to stabilize. Option B. If my father wished to transfer the apartment to Marcus, he would first pay me $210,000, roughly the estimated value of my foregone real estate opportunity over 5 years, calculated conservatively using Portland market data, as compensation for my documented reliance on his promise. Option A was genuinely generous, I thought. I was offering to solve both problems at once. Marcus gets stable housing, I get the asset I was promised, and no one goes to court. There was a 10-day silence. Then Marcus called me again. This time, his voice was different, more serious, stripped of its usual ease. "I talked to Dad for 3 hours last night," he said. "Danny, I didn't know about the emails. I didn't know about any of it. He never told me he'd been referencing the apartment in writing for 5 years. I know. I told him he has to make this right. I told him I won't accept the apartment if he doesn't." That stopped me. "Marcus, I mean it. It's not mine to take if it was yours first. That's not who I want to be." I sat with that for a long time after we hung up. Whatever complicated feelings I had about my brother, that phone call shifted something. He hadn't had to do that. No one would have forced him to. He did it because it was right. Update 4. The real conversation. 2 weeks after Marcus's call, my father asked me to come to Beaverton alone again. Same kitchen table. Same coffee. But the atmosphere was entirely different. He looked like a man who had been awake at 3 in the morning with himself and not enjoyed the company. He started by saying that he hadn't expected me to fight. He said he'd told himself the promise was casual, that I'd understand, that I'd see the reasonableness of helping Marcus. As he talked, I realized he had spent 5 years building a private narrative in which the promise was softer than it was, more flexible, more conditional, and my decision to document it and enforce it had shattered that narrative completely. "I convinced myself you didn't really need it," he said. "That's not how promises work, Dad," I said. "You don't only keep them when the other person needs something." He nodded slowly. He looked at his hands. "Your mother would have told me the same thing." We sat in silence for a moment. It wasn't comfortable silence, but it was honest silence. Then he said, "I want to accept option A." I asked him to say it clearly. "I want to transfer the apartment to you, as I said I would. And I want Marcus and Priya to be able to rent it at a fair price while they get on their feet." I told him I would have Sandra draft the agreement. I told him I was grateful, not in a warm, everything is fine way, but in the careful way you're grateful when something that cost too much is finally, partially, restored. I also told him something else. I told him that the part that had hurt most wasn't the apartment, wasn't even the money. It was the 5 years of correspondence in which he'd referenced the promise, treated it as real, treated it as mine, and then had stood in his kitchen and told me he had the right to change his mind, as if those 5 years meant nothing. As if I meant nothing. He didn't argue. He said, "I know. I handled this badly. It wasn't a full accounting. It wasn't everything I might have wanted. But it was real, and from my father, real was something." Update 5. The transfer and its aftermath. The transfer was finalized in December, 4 months after that initial August conversation that had appended my year. Sandra handled the paperwork with Tom Breckenridge, and on a cold Wednesday morning, I sat in a title company office in downtown Portland and watched my name go onto the deed of a 2-bedroom apartment in the Pearl District. Jennifer was with me. She held my hand during the signing. On the way home, she said, "How do you feel?" I thought about it seriously before answering. "Like I won something I shouldn't have had to fight for," I said. "And like I lost something too." She nodded. She understood. Marcus and Priya moved into the apartment in January. We drew up a proper lease. Sandra's firm drafted it, nothing aggressive, just clean and legal, for $1,400 a month in a neighborhood where market rate was pushing $2,700. 3-year term, with the option to extend by mutual agreement. Marcus thanked me when he signed it. He looked me in the eye when he said it, which mattered. My relationship with my father is different now. Not broken, I don't think it's broken, but recalibrated. We still have Sunday dinners occasionally. He still asks about my kids, about the business. But there is a new carefulness between us, the kind that exists after someone has seen something in another person they cannot quite unsee. What I saw in him was this: a man who loved his sons but loved his younger son in a particular, anxious way, the way you love someone you're always afraid you're losing. Marcus's instability scared my father in ways my stability apparently didn't. And when fear drives decisions, promises become negotiable and written words become inconvenient. I don't think my father is a bad man. I think he is a man who made a bad choice and spent a year telling himself it was a reasonable one. What he saw in me, I think, was something he hadn't expected, that steadiness has its own form of teeth. That the son who never causes drama, who handles things professionally, who shows up on time and builds things carefully. That son will, when something genuinely important is at stake, build a file, hire an attorney, and sit across a mediation table with his documentation in order and his expression calm. Carol Weston sent me a card in January. It said, "Your mother would have been proud of how you handled this. Not the fight, but the way you fought." I put it on my desk at the office, where I can see it. Reflection. Here is what I know now, on the other side of this. A promise is not a contract. I learned that in Sandra's office on the first day. But a promise, made in front of witnesses, reinforced in writing over 5 years, and relied upon in documented ways, a promise like that has weight. Not always enough weight to win in court, but enough weight to make a reasonable person pause, reconsider, and negotiate. I did not want to sue my father. I want to be clear about that, even now. The lease pendens filing was a tool, not a goal. The demand letter was a message, not a declaration of war. Every step was calibrated to say, I am serious, I am prepared, and I will not simply absorb this. Not because I am vindictive, but because I had made real decisions based on real words spoken by my real father, and those decisions deserve to be honored. I also want to say something about Marcus. He did not have to call me. He did not have to tell our father that he refused to accept the apartment under those circumstances. He had every incentive to stay quiet and let the situation resolve in his favor. Instead, he chose his brother over the windfall. That took something from him, not just courage, but a kind of integrity I had, if I'm honest, underestimated in him. Our relationship is better now than it was before any of this started. There is something between us that wasn't there before, a mutual knowledge that when it counted, we both chose the same thing. The apartment is mine. It will be part of my children's inheritance. Marcus and Priya are stable and building something. My father is 67 and has 2 sons who, despite everything, still show up to Sunday dinner. It is not a perfect ending, but it is an honest one. And if there is one piece of advice I would give to anyone reading this, it is the same advice my high school civics teacher gave me 20 years ago, which I thought was dry and forgettable at the time. Put things in writing. Not because you don't trust people, but because memory is unreliable, circumstances change, and the written word survives both. My father said, up to $460,000. Not bad for your future, huh? He was right. It wasn't bad at all. TLDR, Dad verbally promised me his apartment 5 years ago in front of witnesses and referenced it in writing multiple times. When he tried to redirect it to my younger brother, I hired an attorney, gathered documentation, filed for mediation, and ultimately received the apartment as promised. Brother, to his credit, refused to accept it under disputed circumstances. Dad and I are still talking. Lesson: document everything.